I want to go back to the nuclear energy front today and that hypocrisy from the government. As I said, not just hypocrisy, it was a lack of policy integrity, of intellectual consistency writ large from a Labor Party that's willing to support nuclear power at sea under the AUKUS deal, but wants to demonise the very same nuclear power on land under the very same deal. Here's the opposition leader on this very point during question time today, and then that response, the nonsensical response from Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles.
Overnight at COP29, the United States and the United Kingdom signed a new agreement for civil nuclear reactor collaboration. The UK Labor government has stated the agreement is, and I quote, expected to also be signed by Australia. And it will, quote, speed up the deployment of cutting-edge nuclear technology to help decarbonise industry and boost energy security. Can the Acting Prime Minister confirm Australia will sign this civil nuclear reactor agreement?
I can confirm that the Australian government will not be signing that agreement.
Now, what sparked that exchange was news overnight from the UN's climate conference in Azerbaijan, where the UK Secretary for Energy, Ed Miliband, announced the British government had just signed a new agreement with the United States to speed up the development of civilian nuclear energy as a key plank in the global push to decarbonise and get to net zero. As Miliband's press release makes clear, this new agreement will commence in March next year. And here's what ticked the Labor mob off. He says, and I quote, Australia is expected to join its UK and US allies in this endeavour. Now, you what? Poor old Ed Miliband. How is he to know that his Labor cousins here in Australia might love nuclear power at sea, but on land, they're terrified of it, claiming, as Richard Marles did, that it's just too expensive.
Did the Australian government make any representations to the UK government for the reference to Australia contained in the press release titled UK and US join forces to speed up advanced nuclear technologies to be withdrawn?
We're not signing this agreement. This agreement is in respect of two countries which both have a civil nuclear industry, and we do not.
Too expensive. Try telling that to the pensioner who used to enjoy some of the world's most affordable power in this country, but is now forced to pay for power that's amongst the world's most expensive. So much for that great Labor lie that renewables are cheap. This deal between the UK and the US, signed overnight, is an extension of the pro-nuclear agreement signed by 31 nations at last year's COP meeting to triple the world's nuclear energy by 2050, and also to expand new technologies like small modular reactors before the end of this decade. Meanwhile, here at home, Labor troglodytes bury their head in the sands. For a government that keeps demanding the opposition detail and cost its nuclear policies, the Albanese government suddenly remarkably coy about its future emissions reduction target. Now, as you know, Labor's current emissions target is set until 2030. But a new one is due to be announced by February next year for the period from then through to 2035. Here's the Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, on this very point in June.
Let's just break down the 2035 target and the process. We're obliged to do that by next February, and of course we will.
And that promise is backed up by the government's own documentation. This is on its website. It says, and I quote, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, a country must update its nationally determined contribution every 5 years. Australia's nationally determined contribution will include the 2035 target, and it is due by the end of February 2025. Yet speaking to the ABC on Sunday, all the Prime Minister could say was that the 2035 target would be released, he says, quote, sometime next year.
Well, under the Paris Agreement, you have to have a 2035 target next year, right?
Yeah, sometime next year.
Before the election?
Well, our focus is on achieving the 2030 target, because 2030 comes before 2035.
Fudge, fudge, fudge. So why is the government now so determined to put off until after the election any announcements of its 2035 emissions targets? The Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, trying to muddy the waters, was out claiming a day or so ago that Labor can't put its new target out there because it's required under law to consult, and she says they require advice from the Independent Climate Change Authority. Now, of course, she's right. That's all in legislation. But she's caught out in this lie because I can reveal the government has already sought this advice from the Climate Change Authority, as Minister Chris Bowen admitted in this news story back in January, where he revealed to journalist Rosie Lewis that he'd, quote, already written to the Climate Change Authority requesting its advice on the government's 2035 target. And he said to Lewis that the target would be, and I quote, very clear to the Australian people before the election. Here's a copy too of Chris Bowen's letter to the very same authority, asking for their advice on those 2035 targets. And according to documentation on the Climate Change's website, this is the Department of, the Climate Change Authority would provide before August sectoral pathways advice to the government. This is on each sector, such as transport and agriculture, on how they might achieve net zero. The department's own website goes on to say that by the end of this year, so it says the fourth quarter, 2024, it would provide advice on the 2035 target. So again, why the secrecy around the release of these new targets? Why keep voters in the dark when these new targets will, without a doubt, impact the cost not just of our energy, but food and transport too, as net zero pushes deeper and deeper cuts? The Climate Change Authority has already said that the 2035 targets need cuts in emissions in the range of 65 to 75%. Now, that's a drastic increase on the 2030 targets, which we will not meet. You can see why they don't want voters to know the truth of what's coming before the election, can't you? To try and pull the wool over your eyes, the Albanese government is using the ruse of Donald Trump's election as cover. Because if the United States is reducing its climate ambitions, as Trump declared he will, then presumably that means our targets will have to be even higher to make up for the shortfall. How very convenient for Labor. But don't be fooled, Australia. Delaying the release of the 2035 targets has nothing to do with Donald Trump and everything to do with a cost of living election that Labor is desperate to win. Now, as the polls settle into trend and a coalition majority looks more and more possible, Labor can't afford to tell you just how much pain you're in for should they win. This is an absolute scandal from a government that's been totally committed to a climate crusade that's never really been costed, that's never been released publicly, and that clearly these clowns barely understand. What's worse, when they get out of jail free card by our key allies to sign up to a nuclear energy pact, the idiots running the country here say nuclear is too expensive. Too expensive from a Labor government that's made wasting your money an art form. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. Do they think people like me can't read information on a website or something buried in a report? That I don't read their transcripts, that I can't see through their BS? Keep it up, Chris Bowen. As that adage goes, keep quiet and let everyone assume you're stupid. Open your mouth and confirm it.